When Clark Maltz was seen in the orphanage, all the children retreated, huddled in the corner, cautiously peeking at the man with a noble temperament and a face full of indifference. Except for me, I stared straight at the handsome man, and rubbed my little hands. 5 years ago, I entered this world and became a member of the orphanage. But the orphanage deducted food too much, and there was some harassment, which could not be prevented. This golden orphanage is an orphanage dedicated to charity under the Maltz family. Nominally, the Maltz family invests a small $1 million in the orphanage every year, but our 3 meals a day are still porridge and cabbage, and there is no meat at all. My eyes darkened with hunger, and when I saw that Clark Maltz was leaving, I gritted my teeth and jumped out, shouted loudly, "Daddy!" My movements came suddenly, and the man who was originally expressionless paused, slowly lowered his head, and looked at me hanging on his lap, looking slightly stunned. Seeing this, the dean thought he was upset and rushed over to grab me. "Bradley, don't you take her away quickly?" Bradley is a middle-aged man, born honest, but not honest. I often steal the girls in the courtyard. I avoided his hand, tried to be cute, and shouted, "Daddy, you look like my daddy." Clark Maltz, seeing that I didn't give up, the bodyguards and assistants next to me threw pity at me. Just when everyone thought I was going to be kicked away by Clark Maltz, the man suddenly bent down and lifted me up. The man's sharp eyebrows were slightly raised, and he looked at me with an expectant expression, and his eyes moved slightly. The next moment, a slightly awkward voice sounded in the coldness, "Baron, go through the adoption procedures for her." Assistant. My heart skipped a beat, and my eyes widened slightly. I'm just shouting, and that's it. When I followed Clark Maltz home, I glanced at the man next to me who had a strong aura and a bad look, and I felt a little panicked. Clark Maltz, the biggest villain in the text. In the plot, he lost his mother at a young age. His father remarried, ignored him, and threw him to the black-hearted nanny, so that when he grew up, he had a dark mind and ruthless methods, and he couldn't love the heroine, did the wrong thing, and finally ended up with a tragic end of falling into the sea. Thinking of this, I unconsciously shuddered. The bread in his hand fell to the ground with a snap, rolled twice, and stopped next to Clark Maltz's leather shoes. My movements froze. In the novel, Clark Maltz has a very serious cleanliness fetish. Beside him, the man was sitting precariously, and his hand tapping on the keyboard was visibly stunned. The assistant sitting in the passenger seat also saw it. His face changed slightly, and he subconsciously spoke for me. "I'm sorry, Clark Maltz. I shouldn't have bought bread for this kid. Blame me for me. Am I going to go back just after I get out of the orphanage? Don't." Thinking of this, I didn't care about anything, so I immediately picked up the bread with my hands. "I'm sorry." But before I could pick it up, my wrist was gently gripped. I raised my eyes and saw that the man's expression was grim, but the words he said were gentle. "Dirty. Don't want it if you drop it. Is it cold? Baron, turn up the air conditioner a little more." With that, he pulled me up, and when I sat back down, he let go of his hand, and continued typing on the keyboard as if nothing had happened. The assistant was dumbfounded. "Clark Maltz, it's 28 degrees in the car, and if it's any higher, I'll take a sauna." Clark Maltz gave him a cold look. The assistant was silent for a moment. I froze. He's like, not as bad as I thought. Soon, we arrived at Clark Maltz's residence. I thought about it all the way, but I didn't understand what Clark Maltz adopted me for. It couldn't be because I called my dad a few times, and suddenly my conscience was discovered. Right. But if you can't figure it out, you don't want to. Anyway, the boat will naturally go straight to the bridge. As I was distracted, a deep voice suddenly sounded, calling back to my thoughts. "Do you want to hug?" Yes. As soon as I heard this, I subconsciously looked up, and Clark Maltz didn't know when he had gotten out of the car, and walked around to me, looking down at me, still looking a little cold. But I don't know if it's my delusion, but I actually saw a little anticipation in his eyes. It must be a delusion. I opened my mouth and waved my hands, and was about to go down on my own, but the next moment, my body suddenly took off. I was afraid of falling down, so I hurriedly put my little hands around his neck. Clark Maltz probably hadn't held a child before, and his arms around me were a little stiff and a little cautious. as if he was holding some fragile treasure, and he even took small steps. Seeing this, the assistant's pupils widened slightly, and he was directly stunned in place, and it took him a few minutes before he came back to his senses, hurriedly stepped forward, and said respectfully, "Clark Maltz, why don't I hug me? This kid has a dirty..." Before he could finish his sentence, he was interrupted by Clark Maltz. "No, she will be my daughter in the future, and I have to learn to hold her," Clark Maltz said, looking down at me. Seeing that I was dumbfounded, the corners of his lips rose slightly, and then quickly pressed down, wanting to cover up me. It's weird. Is this still the villain I know? Suspicious. I stayed at Maltz's house. I thought Clark Maltz was busy at work and wouldn't have much time to take care of me, but the next day, when I got up, I saw a man sitting firmly on the couch. The morning sun fell through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and it happened to fall on the man's clear side face, which was well-defined and bone-like. Clark Maltz is 28 years old this year, and it stands to reason that he is also at the age when he should get married. But he is a vicious villain, and he is destined to have no good relationship. Suppressing these messy thoughts, I blinked and politely asked, "Aren't you going to work today?" Clark Maltz had already looked over when he heard me go downstairs, and when he heard me ask, his brow furrowed. My heart trembled slightly. It's broken. He probably doesn't like people asking him a lot about it. I don't mean anything else, I tried to explain, but before I could finish my sentence, I heard Clark Maltz say something confused. "Why don't you call Daddy?" My eyes widened. Huh? Is he serious? In front of him, the man lowered his eyes slightly, his black eyelashes trembled slightly, his beautiful lips pursed slightly, and he repeated, "Didn't you say that I look like your father? Now that I've adopted you, you can officially call me Daddy." When he said these words, the man looked calm, as if he was only correcting a small mistake. I opened my mouth, and it took me a long time to squeeze two jerky words out of my mouth. "Daddy." Actually, he didn't look like my dad at all. I said that nonsense. My voice wasn't loud, but the living room was quiet, allowing the sound to fall and reverberate. The man's eyebrows suddenly relaxed, satisfied, and then explained to me softly, "Dad is the boss, and the boss doesn't have to go to work every day." Me. Is that in the script? Looking at the man's old father expression, I always felt that something was wrong, and I couldn't say it, but soon, I didn't have time to think about it, just because, I followed Clark Maltz to the table, expecting it to be takeout or a chef's breakfast. Unexpectedly, I saw a plate of tattered eggs on the table, as well as a bowl of rice like porridge, and the only normal thing was a glass of milk at room temperature. "Eat. I don't know what you like to eat, so I just made a little bit of it." The man's voice came from above. "Listen carefully. There is still some expectation. The villains have been cooking for themselves these years. After all, the world has become what I don't know." I sat down in a chair in a daze, ate the fried egg against the man's blazing gaze, thought for a moment what was the send-off fence, and boasted, "Is this what Daddy did? It's delicious. I'm the best at selling tricks." The voice fell. The man's deep eyes lit up visibly for a moment, and he sat down next to me, and poured the fried egg from his own plate onto my plate, and his voice became more and more gentle. "Eat. Eat as much as you like." Well, this villain is weird. In the days that followed, Clark Maltz occasionally goes to work and spends the rest of the time with me. I even bought many Barbie dolls. He just sat and watched me play, his eyes so kind that I got goosebumps all over my body. Me. Could it be that this is a new type of perverted hobby? Fortunately, these days didn't last long. One weekend, after lunch, Clark Maltz's assistant came, as if there was something important to discuss with Clark Maltz, and when I saw this, I immediately met and said that I wanted to go back to my room. "It's coming. It's coming." I'll just say, how could a villain put his mind on me, a useless child? He must be targeting the male protagonist and competing for the female protagonist. In the plot, at this time, Clark Maltz and the male protagonist Lucas are competing for a piece of land, and Clark Maltz can't get used to Lucas marrying the female protagonist, so he frantically stumbles on Lucas. There is no morality in the main game. That's all we have to talk about now. Hearing my words, Clark Maltz didn't stop me, called the assistant and went to the study. From the afternoon until late at night, they didn't come out except for dinner. The night is quiet, with a bit of winter chill. When the assistant left, I happened to be a little thirsty, and when I came out of the room, I saw Clark Maltz walking in the direction of the door with the people, and the door to the study was open. I subconsciously glanced back. As far as I could see, I saw a few pieces of paper falling from the wooden floor of the study, and one of them was swept up by the wind and slid to my feet with the movement of the door opening. I crouched down, picked up the piece of paper, and was stunned when I saw the words on it. Analysis report of major kindergartens. No, dare they conspire all night, just thinking about this. Why don't you sleep yet? Just then, a voice came from behind him. I shuddered, looked back at the man's puzzled eyes, didn't know what to say for a while, looked down, and saw that I was still holding the piece of paper in my hand, and suddenly held a hot potato, and hurriedly handed it over, and explained in a low voice. The wind blew to the ground. I came out to drink some water, and I was going back. Clark Maltz nodded coldly, didn't ask much, thought about it, and seemed to think that something was wrong, raised his hand and touched my hair, and his voice was a little softer. Isabel Shelley, good night. She rarely said such things to people. His tone was a little unnatural, but with a bit of hidden tenderness. Isabel Shelley? My eyes flickered slightly, and the tips of my heart rippled. In my previous life, most people would just call me Isabel Shelley mockingly, laughing at me as I fell from the clouds into the mud. Scenes from my previous life suddenly flashed before my eyes. When I was a child, I was kidnapped, and after I escaped, I wandered in an orphanage, crawled in the mud until I was 16 years old, and was finally found by my parents. I thought it was the end of suffering, but I didn't want it to be the beginning of falling into the abyss. There are no fake daughters in the family to compete with me, only countless courses. Mom and Dad said that if the Shelley family's daughter was a celebrity, she should be able to handle it. Because of my desire for love, I tried my best to please everyone, and make myself the daughter they wanted. Can be later? My family went bankrupt and I was sent to get married. The marriage partner is an old man, who is 30 years older than me, and he has nothing in character and appearance, only money. At that moment, my faith suddenly collapsed. What talent, what looks, it's just a bargaining chip to exchange money rights. Suddenly, in this life, the dean would only call me a dead girl very fiercely, but I didn't want to. In the end, the most gentle call for my name was the villain, who I hadn't known for a long time. I lowered my eyes, my eyelashes fluttering. Once upon a time, I had a father, but I didn't seem to have one. In this life, I don't have a father, but I have a father. Countless thoughts converged, like sparks falling on the heart, burning people's hearts. I looked up and said, "Good night, Dad. What about vicious villains? If he treats me with sincerity, I will repay him with sincerity." After that day, I got a little closer to Clark Maltz. He cooks for me. Daddy did a great job. And then, when he didn't have time to cook for me, he held the tea house that his assistant lined up to buy for breakfast. Well, it shouldn't be a problem to reward yourself once in a while, right? This went on for 2 months. During this time, I heard that after I left the orphanage, Clark Maltz made drastic reforms, and the director and several teachers of the orphanage were replaced, and the meals were improved. I was looking for a chance to mention it, but now I don't need to. Clark Maltz leaves early and returns late every day, and I habitually wait for him to come back and eat together. But this night, I waited until 7 o'clock, and the people who usually arrived home at 6 o'clock still did not come back. I don't have a mobile phone. There is a landline in the villa, but I don't know Clark Maltz's phone. Just as he was thinking, there was a sudden movement at the door. I thought it was Clark Maltz back, jumped off the couch and walked in the direction of the hallway. "Daddy, Clark Maltz has returned to the old mansion, and asked me to bring dinner to Miss." It was the voice of Assistant Baronicam. The slender man was carrying a big bag of food in his hand, and when he saw me coming out, he hurriedly used his body to block the wind and rain outside for me, and said, "It's raining outside. It's freezing. Young lady, go in quickly." My gaze subconsciously passed over him, and landed on the pouring rain outside. It's winter, and Haikang is a rainy city. I guess it's going to rain all night. I thought about it for a moment and asked again, then Daddy doesn't live here tonight? This stopped Baron Akam, and the young man's expression changed slightly, as if he was considering his words, and for a long time he hesitated to reply. I think I will come back. Every time Clark Maltz stays there for not long before he is kicked out. No, he will come back. My eyebrows furrowed. Before I could say anything, the assistant's phone rang. He put his things down, didn't think much of it, and picked up the phone in front of me. Hey, the tone on the other end of the phone was serious. Clark Maltz is injured. Bring the medical kit and come to the old mansion. My pupils shook. Clark Maltz is injured. I didn't care about anything at once, turned around and ran outside. Baron Akam was stunned. I looked down at the large pile of steaming food still on the ground, turned my head again, and saw that I had already run to the door, quickly picked up the things, rushed into the living room, put down the food, and chased after me quickly with the medicine box. Miss, wait a minute. When he got into the car, seeing my little face, Baron Akam stopped talking, scratched his hair in a hurry, and finally drove me to the old house. The old house is some distance from the villa, and it takes more than half an hour to drive. I was inexplicably nervous. In the plot, Clark Maltz's injuries are common. When I was young, I was deliberately pinched by the black-hearted nanny with the door, and my little finger is still a little deformed. When he grew up, in order to gain a foothold in the Maltz family, he fought for power with his stepmother's children, and had a car accident and survived. If he was a stranger to me in the past, I didn't care if he was hurt or not, but now, he's my dad. Thinking about this, my heart became more and more anxious. The rain blurs one's vision. After a while, the car drove into the old house, and in the distance, I saw a familiar tall figure coming out of the door, and behind him, a stern voice came out, especially clear in the night. You're a white-eyed wolf. I knew I should have strangled you in the first place. It's the same as your mother who died early. It's all angry with me. Clark Maltz didn't say a word, and walked slowly into the rain. Not long after, the car stopped beside the man, and Baron Akam immediately unbuckled his seatbelt and got out of the car, exclaiming, Clark Maltz, through the open car door. It was visible to the naked eye that the man's expression was gloomy. His whole body was soaked, his black hair was hanging down, and there was blood and water on his forehead sliding down with the rain. But he was obviously so embarrassed. But when he saw Baron Akam, Clark Maltz's eyes narrowed slightly. Didn't I ask you to take care of Isabel Shelley? Why did you come here without permission? Martin Crichton called and said you were hurt. I didn't stop, miss. The voice did not fall. The door suddenly opened. The moment he saw me, the man's dark eyes were obviously slightly stunned. I handed out the umbrella I had prepared, and said seriously, I'll take Dad home. Suddenly, the rain became lighter, the man's Adam's apple rolled slightly, and thousands of emotions suddenly surged under his eyes, and the tails of his eyes seemed to be a little red. Go home, I moved to the other side to make room for him. Mr. Akam bought a lot of delicious food. Let's go back and eat together. Daddy doesn't have to do it. Okay. Clark Maltz's eyebrows softened, but instead of sitting next to me, he sat in the passenger seat, wiping the water with the towel in the car. The assistant was still driving, and when he heard my words, he subconsciously answered, yes, Miss is cute and eats the dishes of that restaurant, and every time she eats it, she is full of praise, as if she has never eaten delicious food. Me, assistant, what are you talking about? I looked up tremblingly, and saw that the man who was originally a little red at the end of his eyes was stunned, and decisively began to harden his scalp. Dad's cooking is also delicious. Unfortunately, Baron Akam is a man of little eyesight. Hearing this, the man's mouth opened and he asked in surprise, Clark Maltz can cook. You're pretty good at deceiving people, little girl. Ha 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 ha. As soon as these words came out, there was a strange silence in the car. Baron Akam, what's wrong? Me. Ha ha. Guess why I don't laugh. Eventually, Baron Akam realized that something was wrong, kicked us off the accelerator, dropped us off the accelerator, and slipped away without stopping. He tried to cover up the topic. Clark Maltz, goodbye. I'll send the papers tomorrow. Clark Maltz's expression was cold. Baranakam. When I watched him go away, I always felt that he was not far from working in Africa. But that's not the most important thing right now. I hugged the medicine box, saw that Clark Maltz was still standing there, pursed my lips, and didn't go over, muttering to myself, "It's so heavy." Clark Maltz heard the movement. His eyes moved slightly. He strode over, took the medicine box from my hand, saw that my hands were red, and his brows were slightly furrowed. "Does my hand hurt?" By this time the rain had stopped. In the darkness, the only shining dirty water reflected the bright moon. I smiled and pointed to the ground and said, "Look, Daddy, we've caught the moon." "What?" Clark Maltz didn't react at first, but when he saw the moon in the stagnant water after following my gesture, his heart softened, and he said helplessly, "Well, then Daddy went find a basin to put it up. Didn't you even say I was in a VE?" I raised my eyes in surprise and met the man's gentle eyes. There is something in the bottom of my heart, breaking through the ground. I know, it's flesh growing back. Clark Maltz's injuries were not very serious. When I was done, I bandaged him briefly, out of bad taste. I put a bare hemostatic patch on him, and I also blew it on purpose. Woo, fly away in pain. Actually, I don't know if it's useful, but I've seen other mothers do this when they bandage their injured children. At that time, I was just envious of other people's parents. Later, when I got home, I was injured, but my mother only asked the doctor to bandage me. The thought had just fallen. The little hand was suddenly grasped. "The palms of your hands are cold." I looked down and saw the man blowing on me awkwardly. "Daddy blows Isabel Shelley too." I laughed. We were like two fools. After the wound was treated, Clark Maltz got up and began to clean up the table. But he didn't know what to think of, and his figure suddenly froze. I followed his line of sight and saw that the lunchbox on the table was cleanly eaten. I turned to leave, but the next moment, I heard the man behind me whisper, "Isabel Shelley? What a delicious meal." My steps paused, and my little face turned red. Can this stubble be passed? And so it went on for a few more days. While I was lazily enjoying my carefree days as a child, Clark Maltz picked and chose the best kindergarten in the city. Me. Actually, I don't really want to go. But Clark Maltz didn't listen. On the day I was sent to kindergarten, the man deliberately wore a business suit, standing at the school gate, like a poster, attracted the attention of many parents. Some people are even talking about, "Isn't that Clark Maltz?" I didn't hear he had a daughter. It's normal for a character like Clark Maltz to have a daughter in private. And recently he also won the land in the suburbs. And he is in the limelight, and I don't know who Clark Maltz's girlfriend is. Clark Maltz took the land in the suburbs. My eyes widened when I heard this. In the plot, although Clark Maltz had the advantage at first, but then the female protagonist was accidentally injured, and in order to save the female protagonist, he missed the bidding meeting, so he gave up the land to the male protagonist. Although he is a villain, he is true love. He doesn't know what he's busy with lately. It's gone after work. I thought he was going to save the heroine. In the face of my gaze, the man's eyelids drooped slightly. He pulled his tie with one hand, looked around the fathers who were sending their children to school in an unnatural way, and lowered his head and whispered to me, "What's wrong? Daddy doesn't look good in this. What kind of strange concern is this?" I shook my head and honestly said, "Beautiful." As a villain, Clark Maltz is naturally the best in appearance, but it's just to enter the park, and there's no need to wear a suit that costs millions, right? Those who don't know think he's going to an auction. As soon as these words fell, the little hand was grasped, and the man's palm was broad and powerful, and a low and pleasant voice knocked on his ear, "Then let's go." From my point of view, the man's jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping over the rest of the family. Today is the admission day. Many parents hold their children, one holding the other, and the little ones chattering in the middle, looking at it. Clark Maltz suddenly sighed lightly. "Isabel Shelley, if you follow me, you are destined to have no mother." He said it softly, and I didn't hear it clearly. Before we had time to think about it, the next moment, a pleasant female voice sounded from behind us, "Clark Maltz." The moment the voice sounded, I could clearly feel Clark Maltz's body freeze. I looked back. What catches your eye is an extremely beautiful face. The woman was about 27 or 18 years old. Her long hair was slightly curled over her shoulders. Her palm-sized face was bent like the moon, and she smiled brightly and movingly. And beside her, there stood a handsome man with a long body. This is the female protagonist Olga Ruskin, and the male protagonist Monroe Job. Monroe Job was also handsome in a couture suit, and among them, a boy in a school uniform was looking at me curiously. In front of people, Clark Maltz's expression is already cold, especially in front of rivals. I thought that the rival in love would be very red when they met. He grabbed the land, and he wanted to ridicule the male protagonist a few words, but I didn't expect it. My little hands tightened. The next moment, I heard the man speak, and his voice was very soft, like an ordinary greeting between parents. This is my daughter Isabel Shelley. Me. Where is this heading? Olga Ruskin paused, then smiled, and introduced her child. This is my son, Alvin Job. Clark Maltz bowed his head, took my hand and turned his head to walk inside. Me. Just go. Go. May I sit next to you? As I sat in the classroom, Alvin Job came over and offered to talk to me. I came back to my senses, glanced at him, and didn't speak. When I got closer, I could clearly see that the boy's facial features were exquisite. His white face was still a little baby fat, and his eyes were black and bright. The uniform of the school uniform was worn on him, like a little gentleman, is worthy of being the child of the male and female protagonists, and he looks so good when he is young. But his parents don't have a good relationship with my dad. Shouldn't I talk to him? Seeing me staring at him directly, Alvin Job's handsome little face blushed slightly, took out a handful of candy from his pocket and gave it to me, and said firmly, "Your father and my parents know each other, and we will be friends from then on." Me. Who gave you the illusion? But Alvin Job's brain circuit was obviously different from the others. He moved a chair and sat next to me, looking straight ahead, but in the rest of the light, the boy's little hands clutched the fabric on his knees, as if nervous. I didn't have a problem with him, so I just let him go. Left and right are not a big deal. Adults shouldn't have been involved in children, but at the end of the day, I suddenly felt that something was wrong. Alvin Job seemed to have caught me with a sheep. During the meal, he sat across from me. When playing, he was in a group with me. Even when I went to the bathroom, he came back to me. At the end of the day, I had a little tail behind me. When school was about to end, other girls and boys wanted to come and play with us, and I was just about to agree, when my sleeve was suddenly pulled, and when I turned around, I saw Alvin Job standing next to me, clutching my sleeve tightly. The corners of his lips pursed into a straight line, as if he looked cold. I don't know why. What's wrong? The boy and girl on the other side blinked, also confused, and said enthusiastically, "Let's play together." But Alvin Job remained untouched, seeing me staring at him. Slowly, that little face was dyed red, his eyes were also watery, and his voice was a little aggrieved. "I don't want to play with them. I'm afraid." Afraid. I was blown away. This kid is so young that he is a social phobia. But it turns out, the colder Alvin Job looks on the surface, the more socially frightening it actually becomes. My eyes rolled. I seemed to have the secret of Alvin Job. It didn't work, but I don't know why. But I still feel happy, the corners of my lips hooked, and with a smile on my face, I protected the person behind me, and politely declined, "I'm sorry, I can't play with you." The little boy and the little girl left disappointed. I turned around and saw that Alvin Job's dark eyes were moist, cute and pitiful, and I couldn't help pinching his little face. "Don't worry, we'll be together in the future." Aha! Alvin Job stared straight at me, and his voice was Grandma's. "What about the hook?" "Okay." The two little fingers hooked together, and the thumb was pressed again. Alvin Job happily followed me until the end of school. But when I got out of school, I saw the familiar license plate at a glance, and subconsciously shook off the little hand I was holding. Alvin Job empty, outside the kindergarten. The moment he saw me, Clark Maltz strode over. "Isabel Shelley." I ran over and was picked up by him, and he said happily, "Daddy." Clark Maltz's eyebrows appeared with pleasure, but the next moment, his eyes fell on the dull-looking child next to him. His eyebrows twisted, as if he wanted to say something, but finally turned into a sentence, "Isabel Shelley. Let's go." With that, He turned around with me in his arms. I spied on his look, and in the plot, Clark Maltz, although he is a villain with a ruthless wrist, never shoots at children, and even says that he wants to be a stepfather to Alvin Job. But it's a pity that the male and female protagonists are very affectionate. However, stepdad, godfather. My eyes lit up. As long as I work hard, can't I kidnap Alvin Job back and recognize him as a godfather? Hey, look at my little clever ghost. In the days that followed, Alvin Job and I are often together, and he is usually very cold. But when the two of us are alone, he will take some snacks out of his school bag, hand them to me, and eat them with me. I couldn't help pinching his face several times, and he wasn't angry, just a little red. I was happy, and my eyes lit up. Well, if he is willing to recognize my father as a godfather, then he will be my brother from now on. We all have a bright future. But during this time, Clark Maltz seems to have become extremely busy, leaving early and returning late every day. I suddenly felt a little uneasy, although he didn't have any problems with his previous performance. Where is it so easy to let go of obsession? So after school, I asked my assistant to take me to Clark Maltz's company. Not long after I arrived, I saw Clark Maltz come out of the office. The man was dressed in a neat suit, as if he had just finished a meeting. When he saw him, Baron opened his mouth to shout, but I stopped him. Wait a minute, Daddy looks like he's going somewhere. Really, Clark Maltz has 2 assistants, usually Baron to pick me up from school, and he himself works with another assistant, Martin Crichton. At this moment he got into another Bugatti Veyron, and headed in the opposite direction of the villa. Where is this going? I turned to Baron and asked, Mr. Akam, is there any other business in the company? Baron was confused. No, I don't have any important business lately, and I heard from the people in the company that Clark Maltz left before he got off work during this time. Then go check it out. I made a decision. Baron didn't feel anything wrong, listened to me, and caught up with one foot on the accelerator. It wasn't until he saw his boss walk into a cooking center that he realized that his face changed, and his lips trembled. Damn, is this what I can see? Will it be put on the assassination list by the boss? I stared at the figure that had disappeared behind the door, and there was a sudden reason for Clark Maltz's recent leap in cooking. He really, I cried to death. What a villain. He's my own dad. So when it was time for dinner, Clark Maltz stared at me in front of me, who kept serving him vegetables, frowning slightly. As the bowls were stacked, he stopped me. Isabel Shelley, don't you like today's dish? I raised my eyes, and my heart was sour at the man's concerned eyes. He suspected that I didn't like tonight's dish, and he didn't guess that I felt sorry for him. Thinking of this, I quickly shook my head into a rattle and said sincerely, no, Dad's cooking is delicious, but Dad has been busy and lost weight recently, so he needs to eat more. Clark Maltz was skeptical, but chose to take my word for it. It's just that for many days after that, I didn't see tonight's dish again. Me, all right, he believed, but not much. Winter turned to spring. I went to elementary school, junior high school, and high school. Originally, I was worried about what would happen to Clark Maltz, but as the days passed, until his father died, Clark Maltz took full control of the family business. But he did not target the Job family as before, except for the occasional friction during bidding. The rest of the time is normal. When I came home from vacation, men in their 40s changed out of suits, put on plaid aprons, and were very skillful at tossing and turning. Hearing the door open, a calm voice came. Isabel Shelley is back? I glanced at the boy who was following me. The young man is 182 meters tall, and his appearance is 3 or 4 points similar to his mother, and he is delicate and outstanding. I looked at it, and the more I watched, the more satisfied I became. Still like. Although his mother can't be my mother, being able to let him call Clark Maltz a dad can be regarded as satisfying Clark Maltz's wish. Right in front of him, Alvin Job looked at me crampedly, his black hair and the tips of his white ears red. Isabel Shelley, isn't it good for me to come to the door like this? After all, we're not yet. It's okay, come in. Like a big bad wolf, who coaxed Little Red Riding Hood, I kept on inviting him in. Alvin Job didn't know why, but he walked in with me, with an expensive wine crate. As soon as he entered, I closed the door and asked him to sit on the couch for a while. He bowed his head slightly and sat down on the couch in a reserved manner. The kitchen of the villa was semi-open, and although it was still some distance from the sofa, Clark Maltz saw the familiar-looking teenager at a glance, and the action of chopping vegetables stopped instantly. When I walked over, I saw the man's slightly surprised face. Dad, do you see him familiar? Hey, it doesn't matter if you can't grab the big one. I'll catch the small one for you. Clark Maltz's hand holding the kitchen knife was so hard that his muscles burst out, and his voice was stoic. Isabel Shelley, are you going to talk to this kid? Before he could finish his sentence, I interrupted. Alvin Job, come on. As soon as he heard this, Alvin Job immediately got up from the couch. He was not good at talking to other people, and his expression became even colder when he was nervous. Hello, Uncle. I looked at the two of them with a smile and said my purpose. Alvin Job, I've always felt very close to you. Why don't you recognize my dad as a godfather, so we can be family in the future? As soon as these words came out, not only Alvin Job was dumbfounded, but even Clark Maltz was stunned. Both of them turned their heads at the same time, staring at me like hell. One race and one unbelievable. I blinked. What's wrong? Alvin Job's face turned white and red and black, and finally his eyes turned red, and he looked at me for a few seconds before he said, I can call Dad. That's great. I didn't notice anything was wrong, and was about to nod, but Clark Maltz had a seizure and said coldly, not necessarily. He put down the kitchen knife. The bruises on his forehead jumped, and he walked out of the kitchen, throwing Alvin Job with the red wine. Then he turned his head and stared at me fiercely, and for the first time he said fiercely, Isabel Shelley, do you like him? I'll break his leg if I like it. Me. Where is this? But seeing that Clark Maltz was really reluctant, I had to give up. But it was too much to shut Alvin Job out like this, and I felt a little uneasy in my conscience, and tentatively asked, do you want to keep him for a meal? And a knife flew in, and I immediately shut up. Oh, the old father is angry. Clark Maltz was angry. When I finished eating, he calmed down and said in a soothing tone, Isabel Shelley, I don't know why you let him recognize me as a father, but Dad only needs a daughter like you. What stinky boy would dare to rob his baby daughter? I umped with a couple of messages from Alvin Job on my phone. Isabel Shelley, I don't know why you asked me to recognize your dad as my godfather, but as long as you want to, I'm willing to do it. I just had a bit of a gaffe. I'm sorry. I'll go back first today, and the gift is at the door. Sad puppy. I pursed my lips, but my heart suddenly beat faster. Damn it. Why is he so good at talking? I kind of want to bully. Seeing that I had been staring at my phone, Clark Maltz's eyes darkened. In the middle of the night, he got up and went back to the house, and made a threatening call. Hey, Monroe Job, your son calls me Dad. Alvin Job, who just got home. I covered my face. When it's over, I feel like I've done something terrible. Clark Maltz extra. As he prepares to snatch Olga Ruskin, Clark Maltz suddenly awakens. It turns out that he is just a vicious villain who can't be loved, and he targets the male protagonist Monroe Job everywhere, and in the end, he can't die well. The thought of that bleak end sent a chill down his back. After locking himself in his room for days, he finally calmed down. There is a saying that is quite true. A twisted melon is not sweet. At first, he just hoped that the girl who was as bright as the sun could live well. I just don't know why, but in the end, it will evolve into such an irreversible situation. After thinking about it, he turned his attention back to his career. After learning that there was something wrong with the orphanage where the Maltz family was charitable, he decided to check it out for himself. At that time, he didn't think that a girl would rush up and hug his leg and call Daddy. When he looked down, the girl was still shouting, Daddy, you look like my daddy. Clark Maltz was in a trance for a moment. Father. For the rest of his life, he only called the man in his biology his father. Somehow, he felt compassion for this girl who had never known her life. He thought, if he is destined to live a lonely life, it is better to adopt a daughter. It turns out, he made the right choice, especially when he came out of the old mansion. It was raining and the car door was opened. The girl appeared in front of him in a beautiful princess dress like an angel. Her eyes were full of worry and she said to him, "I'm here to take Daddy home." That moment, the blood flow in his chest was flowing rapidly. His breathing was slightly stagnant, his eyes were slightly red, and he lost speech for a moment. But there was a thought in my heart that lingered for a long time. Isabel Shelley is a gift from God. He wants to learn to be a good father. As for this vicious villain, whoever loves it, go for it. The end.